Something that's so important as the Olympics supposedly going on, interesting to see how few people wanted to really, I suppose, discuss some of the nitty-gritty of this G4S story, which has been a global story, massive story, and I don't know how if people keep track of these things as I did ever since we heard the news a week and a half ago or so that 3,500 troops were going to be drafted in to really take over from G4S in the leadership roles in security. That we had 6 days of this being the main story in the country at the top of the bulletins, which is quite extraordinary. Certainly when you consider that Andy Davis's little email that he decided he wasn't really interested in actually turned out to be something massive. So I think, tell you a bit about myself. I mean, I've started in the aviation business down at Biggin Hill, remember that little place down South London. I was brought up in South London. And then worked for Greater London Radio, the BBC, in the early 1990s, doing programmes. So I wasn't working to a news desk, I was working on news programmes. That is, there was a programme called The Johnny Walker Show, which was on at lunch times, and Tommy Vance in the evenings, the drive times programme. So what I was doing was really setting up interviews for those programmes, working very closely with the news desk. And it was really the first bite of the cherry. This is the thing I love about radio, is, you know, the newspaper people and the TV people will all be queuing up a story wherever they are, if it's a specific location. And I used to leave it till last, because you know that the radio stuff is going to go out to people before anybody else. The other thing is, for example, some big story that was happening, like, for example, the stock exchange bombing in London by the IRA in the early 90s. We had, you know, we heard about that. We used to get what we used to call the voice of God in the ceiling, which was actually Broadcasting House, which would radiate out to the relevant local radio stations, and someone's voice would come on the ceiling. There has been a bomb at the stock exchange. Suddenly people would start moving, and reporters would be assigned to cover it. But what you think you do with radio, which is what I did that morning, is I had a friend that worked right next to the stock exchange, so I got straight on the phone to them. He said, "Oh, you need to talk to the Royal Bank of Scotland. They're 3 or 4 floors up from us." And he gave me the number. Within a few minutes, we had somebody live speaking on the radio, explaining to the public listening the scene as the police were arriving at the bomb scene. So, you know, what we're able to do with radio is really, I suppose, be ahead of all the other media and get the first chance to interpret events, which is what made me, I suppose, it's once you've worked on that kind of thing, you can't really give it up, ever. It's not something that you think, no, I can't be bothered with that anymore. It was the chasing of the story is a bit addictive. So certainly when I finished with the BBC, I didn't give up on any kind of interest in journalism. I kept a lot of notes at the time. I found that the internet was around just when I finished there. So a lot of those notes then went online as a sort of, and I would advise everybody to do this. If you've got notes about anything that might be of interest to somebody you've never met and are never likely to meet, put them online. It's like a sort of filing cabinet of information where you never know where it's going to become useful to somebody. And you know, that's really what I did with a lot of stuff when I finished at the B. But then I started looking into the Bilderbergs, which are a very interesting little organisation. They were basically started by a guy chaired by Prince Bernhard of the Netherlands, and he was in the SS during the war. He was a Nazi. He was also a consummate liar, and he chaired the Bilderberg conferences for 20 years. Can I just see how many people have heard of the Bilderbergs? Oh yeah, pretty much. That's great. I can guarantee you, when I started doing this stuff 15 years ago, very, very few people even knew they existed. Now, at least we have an idea that there is a sort of criminal financial oligarchy in the West that's basically like a sort of international mafia that are steering events. And I think, you know, once you realise that a lot of what we're seeing at the top of our society, including in our media, is to do with a particular idea of ownership. That is to say, once you're so rich, you can buy up as many yachts as you want, as many prostitutes, whatever. You start wanting to buy politicians, political parties, media. Ownership is what it's all about. And actually, ownership is not what life is all about. It's all about sharing. And it's completely, their philosophy is the total opposite of that. Anyway, getting back to our story about the Olympics, I think it's probably useful just to explain some of the backstory to it all, which is how it actually happened. I mean, if I could go back a few years to the first Gulf, invasion of Iraq, just before that, if you remember, there was a whistleblower at GCHQ, Catherine Gunn. She got some information at GCHQ that said that the Americans wanted to control the outcome of the Security Council votes, and that she got an email in her office at GCHQ, Government Communication Headquarters in Cheltenham, explaining that they were going to try and fix the vote at the Security Council. She took that information out of GCHQ, very naughty lady, and she took it to The Guardian. But she spent weeks fretting, biting her nails, not sure if The Guardian were going to use the information. That's where I think this is all really crucial, because if you risk your life, possibly, to go to the press with something, and then they decide, look, this is too hot, we're going to just put it in the shredder. Where is democracy in this country? And that's the situation we're in, and we've got to have an alternative press, because the mainstream press is not doing its job, and I'll explain why not. When this YouTube interview with Ben, the 40-minute interview, many of you will have heard, we first did 22nd of June on this story. When it started going viral online, there was a bit of interest from the mainstream press. Journalists got in touch with me, I put them in touch with Ben, and we were thinking, well, maybe this is just going to come out from the mainstream via, but it didn't. Ben was being interviewed. Ben was interviewed by the various people who'd probably tell you himself. But I know for a fact, at least the BBC and the Daily Mirror, their crime correspondent, interviewed him a reasonable amount of length, had a long chat with him on the phone all about what was going on, and then nothing happened. Nothing. Of course, the implication of this being that there's two sides to this story. There's the money side, which is all this public money, £300 million, which has been thrown at G4S. And then there's the other side, which is that this is actually a really good story. So which way are you going to go? Because the money side of things is horrible. If you're actually going to run the story, it means that maybe G4S are going to lose their contract. You may get sued by G4S if you've got it wrong. And also it means that people aren't going to go to the Olympics. Because if this story gets out there, many, particularly young people who are switched on and canning, are going to go, well, I'm not going to the Olympics if there's no proper security at all, and any terrorist can get in. So there you've got a real logjam. Now, I think what actually happened was quite a positive thing, ultimately, is that we now do have security at the Olympics. I mean, I don't know what do people think about that. Is that good? I mean, there's a dispute out there in the cyber world and in people's minds. They think this is whole thing is a setup and that the whole thing is to bring the military in. I don't think that's true. I think that actually Ben is a genuine guy, and I think that the whole point was to make £300 million for G4S without them having to hardly lift a finger and do anything, and that there was quite a large possibility that was going to happen. And then also there's more of a possibility of someone creating some kind of false flag event, easily getting something in there and doing some dangerous things at the Olympics. That was a real possibility. I think that's less of a possibility now. And my own prediction, for what it's worth, is that we're going to have no trouble at the Olympics. I mean, for what it's worth, I say, because we never know what's going to happen. I just think the odds are now a little bit more stacked in the favour of the people attending the Olympics and the athletes. So ultimately, that's what we're here to talk about, isn't it? To see is this, and we'll have some time for the discussion afterwards. Now, I think it's also worth mentioning that we're also in a financial crisis, aren't we? But this isn't really a financial crisis at all. It's a crisis of tax havens with, we heard at the weekend, £21 trillion, which should be being taxed to pay for our NHS and our schools, etc., is actually offshore in tax havens. Every year we could make £70 billion extra will come into the country if we actually tax that offshore money. And we stopped that. So what is going on in this country that we have such absolute mess in our economics and politics? And I think it comes back to the exact same thing, the ownership of these political parties, certainly the top levels. I mean, I meet a lot of local politicians who are very nice people, but the parties are owned and the media is controlled. Whereas we were hearing with the BBC and the Mirror, the journalists will come and have a chat to Ben, but once it gets up to the level of the editor's saying, no, we can't do this. Because they are absolutely wedded to this establishment system, and they don't like stories which will really rock the boat. What I used to hear from time to time at the BBC was, it's the wrong story. It's the wrong story. And that is what often happens in newsrooms. If you have a situation where someone is saying that, well, actually, it's just the wrong story. It's not that it's a bad story, it's just that it's a story that people don't want to hear. Then we don't have democracy. You need to have a loop, in case you haven't noticed with democracy. You've got to have, the public who are voting have got to have information. I've got to have information about what they're voting for. And if they don't have what they're voting for, you don't have democracy. Well, actually, we have an elected dictatorship in this country anyway, because the cabinet that makes the decisions is an elected dictatorship. So I don't quite know if we're qualified to be spreading democracy around the world. The problem with this financial system is that it is just that. I mean, we hear constantly sort of bad things generally about religion, but there is a religion in this country, and that religion is money. Money is a religion of its own. It means, essentially, what they're saying is, money talks. And if we just go into a horrendous bit of history, which I've been looking at recently, which is the Nazis in South America. One of the things they did at the end of the Second World War is Hitler's people knew that they were going to lose after D-Day, so they got all of the wealth they'd looted from Europe and they moved most of it over to South America. Now, over there, in 1963, was a Mossad, the Israeli Secret Service hit squad, ready to kidnap Nazis. And what they did is they kidnapped Adolf Eichmann, they brought him back to Jerusalem and they put him on trial. At which point, there was a real hoo-ha. He was then hanged in Jerusalem. But a lot of the money that was coming into Israel at the time was coming through what's called the Bormann network. Now, Martin Bormann was Hitler's deputy, and Bormann was over there running a network, and he'd set up 750 companies, and he'd invested all the money that they looted from Europe, which had been laundered, a lot of it through the United States, in those 750 companies. And the directors of those companies were supporters of the SS from around Europe and the SS themselves. So he set up a massive financial network and a kind of corporate network to take on the mantle of Hitler, really. I mean, Bormann was his number two. And so I think we've got to question the financial power today and ask, is at least some of this financial power actually built on the rewards of looting Europe in the Second World War? If you don't believe me about this, please, there's a really good book on it which is available for nothing, as put together by Paul Manning, who's a CBS news correspondent in World War II. He spent 2 years of his life looking into this. So Manning dredged up all this information and he wrote a book called Martin Bormann, Nazi in Exile, where he absolutely explains that a lot of our companies, and he wrote this in the early 80s, are actually financed by looted money from World War II, from Europe. And I think that we've just got to be really careful that we don't buy into this whole idea of money anymore. And I'm afraid we've got leadership in this country that do, right now. I mean, as I was saying, elected dictatorship. We've got Lord Green, right? If people have heard this over the last week or so, Lord Green was the chairman of HSBC when they were laundering trillions of pounds for the Mexican drug cartels in 2008. Now, those drug cartels were the people who are basically some of the biggest international organised criminals in the world, were leaving hundreds of bodies by the side of the road of people they killed who got in their way. Lord Green, who's a government minister, was in charge of HSBC when the decisions were made to launder their money. So You know, this is not democracy, right? This is we're being run by organised crime, financial criminals. So I think we've just got to face these facts. I haven't seen that on the BBC, by the way. I haven't also seen on the BBC the fact that Lord Reith, who started the BBC, wouldn't let Winston Churchill on the airwaves until 1938. And we didn't hear voices which were against Hitler on the radio in the 1930s until Reith was sacked, because he's on the record as congratulating Hitler for invading Czechoslovakia. So as you can see, you know, the BBC has got a bit of a track record of being to the far right and supporting fascism. Actually, what happened was that they had to sack Reith in order to get this Churchill and the anti-Nazi voices on the radio in this country. Now, when was the last time you heard that on the BBC? On a BBC history programme? No, because they don't really like to tell you that actually broadcasting is one of the most important aspects of our national life and our national culture. Another part, I mean, I can remember this, is if you go back to 1975, Harold Wilson, he was bugged and burgled by MI5 out of office and forced to resign. And at the time, they said at the time, if you can control the Queen, Heathrow Airport and the BBC, you've taken over the country. Right? So the BBC is certainly one of the key elements in controlling the nation, because they decide really what we see and hear, and what is the national debate. And I'm glad to see that this G4S story finally made it there. Okay, so as to what to do about some of this, I think it's also really important for people to understand how the BBC's changed. I mean, I was there in the early 90s. I could see it going downhill. They were introducing something called producer choice, which was about putting financial boundaries throughout the corporation in a wonderful way. When I first started, it was like one big happy family. People would just talk to each other, share information, no problem. We had nice directories with every different part of the BBC. You could phone up and ask a local radio station, anybody. It was all like one unit. And then John Burt was brought in, and Burtism, and they started compartmentalising everything off into little bits, and you had to then get the permission of your producer if you wanted to speak to somebody else. So the whole thing was fragmented. And I think that that's a large part of why we're in a situation today where something can happen, like the September the 11th attacks, or the 7/7 attacks, without any proper investigative documentary being done on the subject. I mean, there hasn't been a proper public inquiry into the 7/7 London bombings, and as far as I'm concerned, I don't think we're going to see a proper judicial investigation and people, you know, interrogated as to what actually happened. Everything's swept under the carpet. Has anyone noticed with Leveson, the way it's all sort of done to be watched on TV? It's not really any kind of judicial process. People can just come up with any answers they want to come up with. Oh dear, I'm really sorry, I don't remember. It seems to be the standard reply. And there was a wonderful graphic on the BBC, actually, funnily enough, the other day, showing who said, I cannot remember, I cannot recall, the largest number of times in their evidence. Would anyone like to venture a guess as to who was the highest?
David Cameron.
David Cameron. Who else?
Bob Diamond.
No. Bob Diamond wasn't, I don't think, at the Leveson inquiry.
Ronald Reagan.
No, he wasn't there either. But anyway, okay, I'll just tell you the answer. Cameron was second. He said, I can't remember, I can't recall. And I've worked this out as a proportion. Some gave long speeches, right? But Cameron was number 2. I can't recall. He said it 49 times in his evidence. And the most intense use of that expression was a guy called Andy Coulson. He only said it 28 times, but that was actually, he got the gold medal for saying it the most frequently. So, look, what these people are is criminals. They have actually been charged now, at last, isn't that right? Yesterday, after something like 7 years, of the police having absolute prima facie evidence of phone hacking. It's taken them that long to do it. A large part of that is because our press is not telling us these are criminal offences. What they're saying is, oh, well, maybe we need to change the law about press. No, you don't need to change the law at all. The law is already there. It's just the police aren't prosecuting. Now, this gets us, I think, to the nub of the matter with what's wrong with this country and London is the Metropolitan Police. Because what's going on in the police is that there are now more investigations. It's like, imagine now that Scotland Yard, it must be like Iraq, a battleground, or Syria. You've got different factions, you've got criminals within there. Did you know that detectives are coming into work at Scotland Yard on a Monday morning to find that evidence that they've taken months to put together has been deleted from the system and gone forever? That's how bad things have gone. It's become the best organised criminal gang in the country, operating in Scotland Yard. Now, I think what you can do is look at that in parallel with what's going on in the city as well, because the city are also doing criminal activities. We had Ian Fraser a couple of weeks ago on the Max Kaiser show on Russia Today, explaining how in 1992 there was a trial, the Blue Arrow trial, and there was a decision made after this trial of bankers that there were going to be no more prosecutions, and it was just like, okay, you can do what you want now. And so we've had something like 20 years of criminality, constant criminality. So all we're asking for, really, is what Barbara Tucker on Parliament Square and Brian Hall before her were asking for, which is for the rule of law. Let's have a law that applies to everybody. I mean, isn't this an old story that goes back through thousands of years of history, that all we want is the rule of law to apply to them as well as us? We've had looters who've stolen a bottle of water, put in jail for months, and yet these people who've stolen, I mean, the LIBOR fixing scandal, that they've stolen billions and billions of pounds, and yet they are still walking the streets. We've got Tony Blair still walking the streets after his criminal activity. I mean, he of course should be in jail for war crime. So there is, that's really what I'd like to say in regards to the political side of things, is that the media has a duty, it really does, to call these people to account, and it's not doing that in this country anymore. We have to just kick it to do so, but the thing is with the journalists, it's easy to blame them, but it's not them that's really responsible for this. It's the owners of the transmitters, right? The journalists, we journalists do not own transmitters. Even at my community radio, I don't own the transmitter. It's owned by, my higher-ups. And it's also the editors and the managers. And in the BBC, you'll find this massive bureaucracy of editors and managers, and at Channel 4 and all these other places. That's where the problem lies, because they're picking people who are providing us with reassurance, pats on the back, that everything's fine, when it certainly is not fine, right? We've had another aircraft carrier just sent to the Gulf. We have a potential nuclear conflict about to kick off in the Middle East any time with Syria and Iran, because there's every chance that the Iranians do have nuclear weapons. I mean, Ben, fellow, where is he now? Ben. He's outside. He worked on the Cook Report, right? The Cook Report managed to get a sample of weapons-grade plutonium as one of their programs, and from an arms dealer who was bragging, oh yeah, you can buy some weapons-grade plutonium and make yourself a nuclear bomb. No, surely not. But anyway, they took a sample of it, got it tested on the programme, and found, God, it really was weapons-grade plutonium. They got it from Ukraine, from Russia. So don't tell me that the Iranians need to start from scratch, from a centrifuge and a nuclear pile, and make a bit of plutonium to make a bomb. They can get the stuff on the open black market. So there's a lot of trickery going on. My thinking is that this possibly to do with the Iraq business was weapons of mass destruction. Maybe they'll just try that one again. The trouble is, if you look back at what happened with Iraq and WMD, the whole of the press was selling us that lie. What happened at the BBC because of that? Well, Andrew Gilligan was sacked. The Director General, Greg Dyke, was sacked for telling us the truth. What they did is they told us that the weapons of mass destruction thing was all sexed up. And as it turned out, it was. But we weren't allowed to know that at the time. So all I'm saying is, I think ultimately we really do need that alternative media. Better still though, we need good people in charge of our mainstream media who have audiences of millions. And the Cook Report, by the way, had an audience of 10 million when it was pulled in 1997. A massive audience. So there's a real demand amongst the public for this kind of stuff. It's just that it's being stifled. Thankfully, we can watch it on Russia Today a little bit, but I mean, they've stopped us watching Press TV. Press TV's lost its licence from Ofcom, so we're not allowed to see that in Britain. That's the programme from Iran, and so this is really being used, I think, as a precursor to war. Now, what does this tell us about what's been going on in the mainstream press? It brought come back again to Thatcherism and John Birt, and what happened in 87. There was big changes at the BBC. If you remember, there was a kind of, for the older among us, we can remember when we used to get things like World in Action and This Week, Death on the Rock, where a few weeks after the SAS had killed some IRA terrorists, shot them, shoot to kill policy in Gibraltar, we had a documentary on the television explaining it to us this week, Jonathan Dibbleby. Nowadays we don't get any of that at all. It's just one after another lie. We were told the other week, by the way, that the Syrian defence minister, a Christian, who was killed by apparently a suicide bomber in Damascus, in his security headquarters, along with another general. That was week before. That's last week, actually, wasn't it? Last week. How time flies. That actually, eyewitnesses have said that it was a drone strike. It's a missile came down from the ground. So we hear on the news in the morning it was a suicide bomber, and by the end of the day it could be anything. Who cares? Who knows? It was just a bomb. This meme of the suicide bomber is being used all the time to make out that the person that's doing it is a lunatic, they're dangerous. It could be anything. It could be a satellite weapon, you know, a drone. It could be like President Dudayev was assassinated, the head of Chechnya, by the Russians using a missile that locked into his mobile phone. You check that one out online. He was talking, someone phoned him to talk about peace, and he was on his mobile phone, and a missile from a plane homes in on his phone and blown him to pieces. And he's the president of Chechnya. So this technology is out there, it's just that it's not on World in Action anymore, because there was no such thing. We've got Panorama, but it's all very tame. It's all safe. And you know, if nothing else comes out of this G4S story, I'd like to feel that we can give the British media a bit of a kick and say, well, look, come on, you know, let's have some real investigative journalism. The trouble is, of course, it costs money, and the people with the money don't want investigative journalism. What they're doing is they're actually holding back civilization, the advance of our civilization. They're saying, no, no, we don't want that. We want everyone to be basically stupid and ignorant, and just, in a way, like robots. You know, just here's you know, everything that you need to know is going to be served up to you. But actually, you're getting nothing. And I think increasingly people are switching off the BBC. Certainly, young people I know don't watch television generally. They don't really find anything of interest in it. A lot of them are watching stuff on the internet. They'll watch stuff online, they'll share stuff, share files. And there's I think, one of the most positive things is that the attack on the students by the Liberal Democrats, when they went into coalition with the Tories, this really politicised loads of our younger generation to think to themselves, wow, how could these people get us to vote for them and then just sell us out completely? What they've done is they've politicised the whole young generation, and those are very intelligent and educated and canny young people. And I think, this whole image of the youngsters being sort of dangerous, stupid, or whatever is completely wrong. The hoodies, actually they are almost like revolutionaries. They've been made revolutionaries by Nick Clegg and his stupidity in promising them everything and then selling them out after the last election. So coming back anyway to the sort of nub of this, where the BBC has always been the benchmark. Other organisations, we pay for it from our licence fee. We have to pay for it. And it's always been the benchmark. In 1987, they were producing things like the Secret Society series with Duncan Campbell, which was absolutely pulling apart the secrecy of government and the Ministry of Defence. All sorts of fascinating stuff, including a really good programme all about how America would take over Britain if there were a Third World War. Americans would move in and tell us all what to do. Fascinating stuff. And this wasn't liked, so, at least by the Thatcher government. So what happened was, Victor Rothschild, who's I think he's a Labour peer, but I mean he's one of those sort of Labour people you can think, well, they're not really very Labour, a bit of a Blair, maybe. Victor Rothschild spoke to Marmaduke Hussey and said, can you sack the Director General? And Hussey said this in his autobiography. And so he did. Alistair Milne was the guy who was sacked. He was a fantastic journalist, really good Director General. The BBC up till that point had been doing his job. Since then, it's been downhill ever since. And his son, by the way, is Seamus Milne, who's a Guardian columnist, and I thoroughly recommend Seamus. I'm on Seamus's Twitter feed, for example. Seamus is absolutely on the ball, and a really good Guardian columnist. But now, the latest we've got is Chris Patten. He's the chairman of the Board of Governors of the BBC, and he's just sitting next to another Bilderberger on the board. Now, Marcus Agius is the chairman of Barclays, right? He resigned a couple of weeks ago, then he came back again. Do you remember that? The next day. Yeah, the next day he's back, make an announcement, he's resigned, next day he's in the same job as chairman again. This is how cheeky these people are. And also it tells me, maybe there aren't enough super crooks. Maybe they haven't got quite enough of these super crooks to run things in their corrupt fashion. But Marcus Agius was on the BBC Trust alongside Chris Patten, was one of the people that chose the new Director General. These people are evil. They are crooked, and they are in charge of our media. So we really do need to fight back in some fashion, however we can, or by using the internet and media, and do our own media. Now, anyway, I'd really like to, sort of finish by just congratulating Ben generally on his fantastic little bit of work.